Good afternoon and welcome to Macquarie University Liberal Club's Sunday Sessions podcast, live in lockdown for a special lockdown episode. Our guest today is Cameron Shamsabad. He is a lawyer who represents many clients who have been forgive me. He represents many clients who have been caught unawares by the various lockdown rules. Cameron, hello.
Hello, how are you doing today, Andrew?
I'm fairly good, fairly tongue-tied, but I'm joined by my co-host, Rory O'Connor. Hello. Hey,
how's it going, guys?
We're pretty good. I guarantee you, that opening song I was in fact singing behind the scenes. I've got a graduate in that area. Now you'll be able to ask your questions to Cameron. Type them in the live chat, and we'll try and get to as many of them as we can. My first question to you, Cameron. Well, firstly, should we be in lockdown or shouldn't we be in lockdown? What's the point, and what are the benefits?
Well, the difficulty with answering that question is there's a number of facets to it. There's the medical answer, which you would need to get from an epidemiologist, and there's a number of disputing opinions on that. You have the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration, which over in the US has said, basically, these lockdowns have no positive impact really, especially persistent lockdowns actually have a detrimental impact on health because as you go forward, your ability to respond to health crises decreases along with your economic prosperity. So that's one side of things. The other group of epidemiologists say that lockdowns are the only thing preventing the sort of spread of the virus and therefore this large influx into hospitals. In a country like Australia, where we've had the experience that we've had, it seems unlikely that that's actually the case at this point. So there's that aspect of it, of course. The other aspect is obviously the economic sort of opinion. It seems to be now regarded by basically every economist that there's a detrimental effect on the economy if you have a lockdown. It seems to create an outcome where poor people obviously get poorer. It has those impacts which essentially destroy small businesses. It destroys the ability of people to go to work and to get bread on the table, which means that essentially you have governments borrowing large sums of money in order to pump it into the economy either through stimulus or through social security. And then you also have obviously the legal side. Now there's a number of people who say legally that these lockdowns are completely fine, but the reality is in terms of law enforcement, persistent lockdowns have the negative effect that you create mistrust within the community for law enforcement, for policing, and especially for politicians, because whenever the story was last year this time, 2 weeks to flatten the curve, and it's now 18 months later, and we're still going back to the same story again and again and not seeing any positive outcome, the reality is the lockdowns start to be questioned. You have people questioning the authority of the police force. You have people not trusting the politicians anymore, not trusting the elected government officials, and ultimately, and I think very importantly, losing trust in public health officials, which previously were seen as quite neutral and quite, rational people, even outside of the theatre of politics. They've become politicians themselves now. So, whether we should be in lockdown or not, I would answer the question as no. But I can't obviously give a complete answer in relation to all the epidemiological evidence. I can only cite, for example, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya in the US, who says that there is no positive effect of lockdowns in terms of that. I can cite, for example, certain economists that say that it has that negative impact on the economy. But legally, which is, as your introduction put it, I deal with a lot of these COVID cases. I've become the COVID guy now, I think, in terms of the legal profession. The reality of the situation is, I can tell you that the policing of ordinary law-abiding citizens is happening every day, and it is destructive upon our society. That is my belief.
We say destructive. Can you be like destructive in what way?
Destructive in the sense that I had a client who was lawfully exempt, and it's a matter which is currently pending. And they've been told that they can't open their business to support their family because if they do, without a mask on, they will be arrested and in breach of bail, and the police will pursue bail to be refused. Okay, and the bail conditions are that if you take that to its logical conclusion, It means that they could be arrested when going to Woolworths as an indoor space for not wearing a mask because the police simply don't accept that they're exempt. So you create a situation where if the person leaves the house at all, because the police are not accepting the exemption right now status, they can be arrested at any time, essentially. So, destructive in the sense that you now have a family who can't even leave their house. And that's coming directly from the police. I had a very tough conversation with a couple of officers yesterday who relayed that very draconian information to me. So destructive is the word to use.
Do you think the police have any, do you think they're given any leniency in regards to enforcing laws like this?
I think that the correct procedure, if I could say it like this, the correct procedure for the Public Health Act does not really provide them to actually hand out fines like Tic Tacs in the way that they are. If you look at the way the Public Health Act is structured, there has to be an investigation process that goes in. An authorised officer is meant to request documentation through writing, and they're meant to request answers to questions in relation to potential breaches of the Public Health Act in writing. They're not meant to be handing out fines on the spot to people unless really there's an egregious breach happening, okay? But what we're seeing right now is we're seeing obviously there's some top-down directive that's being given to force compliance of these measures. The police have omitted all of those correct procedures under the Public Health Act. They're going up to people and they're saying, why don't you have a mask on? And if you say, I have an exemption, which is where the argument and where the discussion is really meant to stop in that moment, the police are saying, well, I just don't accept that. Sometimes the police will say, this person said they know their rights, or this person said that they don't believe in it, therefore they get a fine. So the expression of your opinion will actually get you into more trouble right now as well. And we've seen that numerous times.
Do we know the top down, do we know who it comes from, that directive?
I honestly can't say. I mean, I'm not well integrated enough to be able to tell you, but I know for a fact, when I've spoken to a lot of the sort of ordinary police officers on the ground, a lot of the sergeants and stuff that are going around and policing these things, when you talk to them on the phone, they don't sound very happy about it. Because naturally, police officers, good people, they really don't want to be policing things like this. But the reality is that the way the public health orders have been structured now, this temporary order, and the government mandate that they've been given at this point in time is force compliance. Get rid of the apathy. Make people either believe that this is a real threat in the virus, or make people scared to dissent. Make people scared to go out into public unless they really have a lawful exemption, in which case, we can work that out later. The reality is they want to make sure people are compliant at this point in time. And that's the difficulty that we face. It's going to cause a great public mistrust in the government and in the police force going forward.
Can I then ask, I know Rory's wanting to ask a question, but if I could sort of expand on that, do you think part of the reason why like a lot of fear has been placed into the public is because we're not prepared to deal with a gain of function, man-made virus? Perhaps we were prepared for other pandemics, but not so much something like this, irrespective of the fatality rate. Sure. Do you think that's part of the reason?
I mean, if you started bringing into it these sorts of discussions about the nature of the virus or where it came from, I mean, there's a possibility that that's part of the government's considerations is that. But the reality is we have the IFR statistics and the IFR data that's come out from numerous studies. Actually, the Santa Clara study I think was done in I think it was May 2020. So it was literally just more than a year ago. They did the first IFR study in Santa Clara County, I think of LA, and the data said that it was about 0.2% fatality rate. And more or less, in terms of a median average, that has been borne out in every IFR study that I'm aware of up until the present time. Now, obviously, I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm just citing the information that I've read. And that was the position. It's still the exact same position now. Doesn't matter about which variant you talk about. Now we get more contagious flus, we get more contagious colds, things like that every year. I almost look back on a day when dying of the flu was a natural cause. Now dying of COVID or something like that, it's got to be something unnatural. It's got to be something controlled. It was never the proper role of government to prevent you from getting sick. It was never the proper role of government to prevent you from dying of natural causes. It was the proper role of government to protect you from despots. Okay, now we've hijacked that, and the government, in the name of protecting you from dying of a, as we now know, not as deadly as it seemed virus, something which has a 0.2% fatality rate on average, is now becoming the despots that they were originally intended to protect against. So that's a very real crisis in terms of our political institutions. The virus itself can yield over time, as it has, through medical advancement, to science, to reason, and to all of the methodologies that we have, and to the freedom that capitalist societies will bring. We're able to actually build that up. But the reality is, if the country becomes despotic and unproductive, you won't be able to get responses to these sorts of crises in the future. And people won't trust those responses anyway.
So one of the questions I had actually relates to an audience question. So I was hoping if you could delve a bit deeper just in explaining the legality of the enforcement and the fines for us. So an audience member has said here, Clive Palmer tested the constitutionality of Western Australia's entrance to the state for lockdown for commerce and was shot down in the High Court. So what do you think about this in your legal opinion? Does this set any bad precedent? So would you be able to break it down a bit more?
Of course. In terms of the Palmer decision, my understanding of that decision is that Mr. Palmer was arguing a sort of implied freedom of movement along the lines of what was previously implied into the Constitution in terms of freedom of communication, political communication in particular. Now, the High Court rejected that there was an implied freedom of movement on the basis of Section 92, which obviously relates to interstate trade and commerce being free. The High Court has taken the position that that provision is related to protectionist policies of state governments, so specifically preferencing domestic trade or domestic production as against interstate trade. Now, it's taken a narrow reading on that point, as opposed to applying to freedom of movement and freedom of trade completely across borders, so open borders for business, basically. It's taken a different road. It said, no, it's specifically if the policy has a protectionist more or less intention behind it, then it will be unconstitutional, more or less. If it has some other purpose, like a public health purpose, and the effects are somewhat protectionistic or somewhat reductive in terms of trade, but that's an incidental aspect, it doesn't really have that effect on Section 92. Obviously, that's sort of narrowing the reading of the law. The reality is, at the time of Federation, the only way you could organise trade, in reality, was to cross the border and to organise trade, whether it was by rail or whether it was by horse or whether it was by boat or whatever it was. The only method you really had at that time was to cross the border. So the intention of our framers, the original public meaning of the text, would have included, arguably, that you could cross the border and you could go and do that. Now, I'm getting into territories here in relation to originalist constitutional thinking. But at the end of the day, as much as that's not a popular thought at the moment among many High Court justices, the reality is, for our framers, the idea that borders could be completely closed, the original generation that started this federation, the idea that they could just lock the borders down would most likely have been completely contrary to the intention of the Commonwealth. What was the point of federating if that was the case? Why not just be 6 independent countries? So, and in terms of Palmer's challenge, Palmer, did make the argument quite well, but the difficulty was, at the end of the day, I think the timing also was very difficult too. We were at the height of it. The High Court was very cautious as to knocking down any of these state borders because they weren't sure what the effects were. My legal team actually right now has a number of other cases relating to the implied freedom of political communication, and we're actually intending, hopefully, to make our appeals to the High Court. And we believe, based on the new evidence that the scientific community has produced in relation to this virus, the High Court would potentially be more interested in actually hearing our arguments, because the state of emergency that has been flared up is not as serious as it actually was believed back when Palmer's decision was published or when it was dealt with.
If I can sort of merge two questions, so how are the lockdowns legal? You're sort of, because I believe the Constitution that covers it at a state level, and that health is governed by the states. I'd like to tie it in with an audience question. Is the Public Health Act vague enough that it can essentially take away any of our civil liberties in the name of public health?
I've been asked this question by a number of clients, specifically in relation to the nature of the Public Health Act and these lockdowns. The reality is, in this country, the way the state governments are structured is not like, for example, the United States. We have a specific constitution with articulated and enumerated powers and certain rights and limits. State governments have what is referred to as plenary power in our system in relation to basically anything that the federal government hasn't touched or isn't able to touch, that they have control over. One of those things being at the moment health. Now, the federal government could actually absorb health theoretically by implementing some international treaty or something of that type. But that's a larger discussion, I guess, in relation to constitutional law. I'm happy to delve into that if you'd like to discuss it, because a lot of people have actually asked, should the federal government step in and take control? But in relation to the state governments, I made the point to a client, there's nothing legally that would prevent the state governments from having consistent one after the other lockdowns, or just setting a lockdown period of 6 months. There's legally nothing you can do really under the Public Health Act to challenge it. The Public Health Act prescribes you're able to give directions. They can keep giving these directions as long as they want, until there's another election. If someone votes them out and changes the health minister or changes the government, hopefully to someone else. But the reality is, legally speaking, there isn't really any limit on how far this can go. It can continue in this fashion.
Well, I remember you said at the start that the public isn't necessarily buying the emergency, but there was a post from Martin Niles, the managing director of the Australian Christian Lobby, said a recent poll asked Australians to rate their chance of dying from COVID-19 if they caught it. The average response was an astonishing 38%, as opposed to the fact that in reality it's less than 1%.
Yeah.
So we've seen Anastasia Palaszczuk and Mark McGowan both be resoundingly re-elected, particularly in Western Australia. Like these policies, this sort of indefinite lockdown, which you've said is totally legal, it's popular.
Well, I wouldn't say that it's popular in so much as the way that the politics has been structured now, and the way that the media is framing things, is that it makes it actually, fear actually makes a very powerful tool for politicians. The more fear was turned up in WA or in Queensland, which was a great deal, the greater the people were to favour the status quo, and the greater chance there was that they were actually able to submit. Now, there has been a very purposeful, I believe, effort on behalf of public health officials and bureaucrats in this country, because they have an incentive to continue this sort of publicity stunt. Because otherwise, when else have we really heard who the Chief Health Officer of New South Wales is? Previous to this, no one even cared. Right now, they're more powerful basically than premiers. We have a system at the moment where the Chief Health Officer is setting the policy of basically everything in relation to all facets of Australian life. There's an incentive there, and the public health bureaucrats have consistently not informed the Australian public of studies, of research, of where we're at in terms of this pandemic, to put people's mind at ease. We're not back where we were in February of 2020. We're now in July of 2021. We have a great grasp on this virus by comparison now. We know what works, we know what doesn't work. We've got examples from all over the world. We can find a policy that moderates and actually develops back into us returning to normal. We don't have to continue with these draconian lockdowns and these hard policies that are proven by this point in our own experience. We just look at Victoria, the economic depression, the psychological damage that it does to a state, that it does to millions of people. And I can go on, I can tell you the stories. Clients who have had their children attempt suicide while they're in lockdown, while they're in quarantine. They can't leave the quarantine hotels to go and visit them. I had a woman with stage 4 breast cancer. They're talking about health. Woman with stage 4 breast cancer, all her oncologists gave New South Wales Health the evidence that her lockdown in quarantine after she'd returned from Mexico for treatment was inappropriate. It was bad for her health. It continued. After so many attempts, they kept knocking it back. These things, they have a dire effect on our humanity as a society. And that's something which we need to be cautious of. We need to moderate moving forward.
Absolutely, absolutely. So one thing I wanted to reference here was, according to the Sydney Morning Herald, the Australian government's Department of Health's Chief Medical Officer, Professor Paul Kelly, said that health experts could in the future measure success based on the number of people severely unwell with COVID-19 rather than total case numbers. So this is considering data that indicates only one person has died of COVID-19 in Australia this year, despite having just over 2,000 cases. So this has been due to few hospitalizations and very few cases of intensive care. So do you think that would be something we'd be looking forward, moving forward with that we'd be treating it more just as a regular kind of disease? I know Scott Morrison's recently mentioned that as part of his 4 stages plan.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what Singapore was talking about in large part as well. Singapore was saying that they're going to treat this like any other viral event or anything else like the flu season. The reality is, if you look at the health outcomes, not just here but around the world have been, since the beginning of 2020, as we've got a greater grasp on things, we're not intubating everyone as soon as they start to develop symptoms or they require going to hospital. You actually find that the rate of fatality has fallen dramatically, basically everywhere. And it's not just based on our scientific understanding, it's also based on the fact that we built up more immunity to these things. In most places of the world, they've had large outbreaks and people have developed natural immunity. My understanding of the epidemiological research is that people who have natural immunity are just as good as people that have vaccine immunity, more or less. And both are susceptible to potentially being reinfected in the future. The only difference is obviously severity. But any policy, I think, that would focus upon health outcomes as opposed to case numbers will be a drastic improvement. If you look at fatality rate, there's no justification for lockdowns at this point. It doesn't really matter where you look. If you look at severe infection rates, there still isn't a justification for lockdowns. You might get a justification for some sort of restrictions that are based on specific studies and empirical evidence. But even if you did have that policy, I think you have an obligation as a public health official, and I think this is something which all the public health bureaucrats need to do. Show us your evidence. Show us the papers. Show us why. Show us the study. Show us the evidence that says standing up at the pub having a beer is somehow more dangerous than sitting down. Show people the evidence. Present the papers. When was it proven? Just base it on something rational and empirical. People will trust you more, and you won't have the sort of outcomes that you're having now. But in terms of what the Australian health officer said, I think it'd be great if you move to a model where you're looking at outcomes rather than case numbers. You're gonna certainly have a much better approach to this, one that's more rational and commonsensical.
I remember something that John Levy said. It's more important to retrieve the information first before you communicate it. And here we've got the other way around, in that they communicate the information I guess they want to put out, and then retrieve it maybe a year later. And after a lot of the damage has already been done. If I can move on to say with vaccines. Scott Morrison recently mentioned that that those who are vaccinated, if they end up catching COVID, they don't catch it for as long. They catch it for about 7 days, and I believe that's part of his 4-stage sort of return to normal plan. Is that those who are vaccinated have come into contact or catch it are to be locked down for 7 days. Do you believe that people should have to follow lockdown rules if they have been vaccinated, or perhaps if the vaccines were more potent in the future, because this is sort of the first round of vaccines, should then those rules be relaxed?
I genuinely don't believe there should be any lockdowns at all at this point. Based on the evidence which I've seen, I don't think there's any policy justification categorically for a lockdown. But if you wanted to talk about vaccinated versus unvaccinated, taking the position, the classical liberal and the conservative position that the government is not to stand in loco parentis, in the role of the parent, you know what the risk is to your health if you catch COVID. You have the ability to go and decide for yourself if you want to go and get a vaccine. The government, through its socialized healthcare system, has made that available to you. Whether that's good or not is a discussion for other people to have, but ultimately that's available to you. People have the information available. If they want to go and get vaccines, they should. This country should not distinguish between vaccinated and unvaccinated. The reality is all that does is create a class distinction in society, and it draws a dividing line. And to be honest, it's a dividing line which the government doesn't want to create, because the reality is right now, there's enough cynicism about these vaccines. You have people from all age ranges saying they don't want to go and get it. The only way that you're going to be able to make the vaccinated category as powerful and as substantial in order to effectuate that policy as the unvaccinated, or more powerful, I should say, is by mandating vaccines, which is exactly what we've started seeing now with aged care workers. Is there's a policy drive. If people are not willing to go and get the vaccine, we will compel them to go and get the vaccine. And it's the exact same thinking which is currently dragging New South Wales into the toilet, because people were not choosing to wear masks because they've already voted with their, so to speak, they've voted with their feet. They've decided what they want to do for themselves. They've decided they want to wear a mask. We're going to force them to wear a mask, and we're going to make sure that we police it. So the reality is people have now made up their minds. In relation to vaccines, it's the same thing. It's available, you have a choice. The government should not be distinguishing between citizens based on these characteristics, at least in my view. I'm open to be convinced if someone can find vaccine apartheid, pro-vaccine apartheid arguments, I'd be very happy to hear them.
Well, going back to something you actually mentioned a bit earlier, you mentioned Singapore. So the next question was, what countries do you think are handling the pandemic well, and what countries do you think are not, and why specifically?
It's a bit difficult. As I said, I think it would require a more in-depth study of those sorts of things. There's definitely some evidence to say that the countries like Singapore have done okay because they had reasonable controls in place. But obviously, they're now moving in a policy direction that's more open. You have places in the United States where they did have, large numbers of cases. Some of them even had large numbers of deaths. But at the end of the day, they continued to stay open, and they're now reaping the benefits. And I would say states like Florida, potentially even Texas, they did the right thing by reopening and not having any restrictions. Economically, they're flourishing, and in terms of cases, they've normalized now the idea that you just have to work it out in a health system. You just have to take your precautions personally. And that ultimately, we're looking at the same group of people we would be basically for any given flu year falling victim to this virus predominantly. So it's really the same sorts of controls you'd have in place. And with the vaccine rollout as well in the US, there's been a great deal of people basically going out and voluntarily getting vaccinated over there because they want to be secure. But as I said, there's places like that you can look to, and they're very successful. But one thing I know for certain, it's not just looking at the examples right now that are extremely successful, it's looking at the examples that are very unsuccessful. If you look at states like California, they've had some of the worst outcomes, not only in terms of health, but in terms of economics. The economics of the situation is dire in a lot of these places that have had hard lockdowns. Victoria has had some of the worst lockdowns probably in the entire world. They had Chairman Dan locking them down every 5 minutes down there. And you can see the sort of effect it's had on the society. You can see the effect it's had on the economy. Businesses are opening up and no one's even going. And the reason why is very simple. You've created a psychological state where people are just beaten. I have people messaging me in, they're saying they're planning on moving out of Victoria the first chance they get. They're planning on moving interstate. So the only thing he's done is he's caused an exodus probably out of his state by the end of the decade. The reality is these lockdown policies, even if completely opening up is not the right policy, which I'm not prepared to acquiesce to, but even if that's not the right policy, we know lockdowns are not the right policy as well. There's got to be somewhere in the middle. There's got to be somewhere on the other end of the spectrum that we have to start looking. You can't keep on having these sorts of policies again and again.
Definitely. And from what you're saying there, it's kind of coming across that perhaps the cure, as in the lockdown, is worse than the actual disease itself, with all the different concerns that are arising out of these different states. Andrew, did you have another question there before I go on?
I was simply going to mention even the WHO eventually conceded that lockdowns do more harm than good. I think I heard somewhere like if you were to lock down, the main purpose would be to bring in the medical equipment that would be necessary to deal with a pandemic. Otherwise, you don't lock down. I guess if I can quickly ask, so forcing people to wear masks is legal. Forcing them to get a vaccine in order to work in a certain area is in order to work in aged care is legal. Could that, like, if for some reason they decide to expand that, could they expand that?
Theoretically, yes. I mean that's the real difficulty we have. Is theoretically they could expand that quite radically. They could make it the policy for most professions. They could make it the policy for entry to all sorts of places. And that is one of the major legal difficulties we face. There really isn't a great deal of rights protective provisions within our constitutional framework. There isn't really a great deal of legislation that we can refer to. And in any case, the Parliament's, the current legislative will is really what the courts look to anyway. The reality is, in a lot of these contexts, if the government began pushing, you would not have a great deal to push back on. And that actually brings me, it perfectly ties in with the point I've been making lately a lot to journalists when I talk to them, and also to clients. Generally, I've been saying this is not just a crisis in terms of politicians. It's not just a crisis of leadership. This pandemic and the policy responses have shown the flaws in our system. And the flaw in our system is, if you in government, you rule as an elected dictator if you so wish. And that is a major flaw. There is not any limitation on power. There aren't structural limitations. There aren't rights-based barriers. You don't have anything you can do to really injunct the government from coming and invading, I would like to say, your home, but now we're talking about invading your body, in fact. So on that basis, when we come out of this, which I'm hoping will be soon, we as a society in Australia need to not only discuss what the leadership of the two major parties has done over the past 18 months, but also the flaws in the system that have permitted them to do these things over the past 18 months. And that's a very serious discussion that needs to take place.
Where could it take place outside of maybe Sky News?
Well, Sky News is always a good starting platform for something like that. It seems like once we start talking about something on Sky News, it gets the ball rolling with the rest of the journalists, and then eventually it trickles down into the mainstream society watching it on YouTube or whatever. So definitely a conversation on that should be started in the media, I think. But one of the very important things we need, I think, is we need a legal process drawn up to address the systemic issues, and we need elections held as soon as possible to determine exactly what the position of the people is in relation to the leadership. So I think the 2023 election in New South Wales, which is constitutionally required, will be extremely important in determining exactly how people feel, a couple of years after all of these things have begun. And the next, for example, Queensland election will also be indicative too, because by that point, people have had time to come out of fear and look at the consequences rationally. Consequences like tourism is dead, billions of dollars have been lost by the people of Queensland. Consequences like, we now don't trust the government. Consequences like now there's a great deal more, for example, depression, anxiety, angst in society, and generally commercial activities being down. So when you get to the end of this, people will come out with a more sober reality, and they will need to determine very, very seriously, based on the leadership platform of the next the next generation of leaders, are these people the type that would try to do the same thing to us again? And I think that's going to be the question politically. But legally speaking, there needs to be a process, whether it's a constitutional convention or something else, put in place for the reformation of state governments and also the reformation of the Commonwealth. In some ways, we need structural reform. You need a proper federation with proper drawn distinctions between the jurisdictions, and you also need state governments limited by some sort of constitutional framework. They need to have a process that they have to go through in order to amend their own constitutions, and it has to be subject to, I believe, the will of the people, sort of the way that the Commonwealth Constitution is.
Are you referring to a referendum?
Yeah, a referendum process, a Section 128 process. Make the bar difficult while you've got the impetus, limit the state government's exertions of power, create a referendum requirement, get the consent of the state people before you're able to actually move forward with any of your new drastic plans. I think entrenching fundamental negative rights in the constitution of the state governments are also extremely important, because the state governments exercise police powers, health powers, all of that. So entrenching fundamental rights, for example, like the right to free speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, due process, equal protection of the laws, those very fundamental restrictions on government power would be a very big step for the future, because it gives the courts and it gives us lawyers grounds to be able to argue there's a limitation here which has been crossed by this most recent law.
I know you mentioned earlier in the conversation that the reputation of some of these institutions or offices have been damaged by the lockdown. I have here that it says here, Dr. Mike Ryan, so he's the executive director of the World Health Organization's Emergencies Program, said at the beginning of 2020 that there is, quote, there is no specific evidence to suggest that the wearing of masks by the mass population has any potential benefit. In fact, there is some evidence to suggest the opposite in the misuse of wearing a mask properly or fitting it properly. And then I also have here from the ABC, this is sometime later then, that the advice on using face masks during the coronavirus pandemic has in fact changed. So I think that's an example of what you were talking about, that the lack of trust, the unclear advice going on there. What do you think some of these institutions could do to kind of rebuild their reputation? And how do you think we should respond? I know some people have called for, perhaps we shouldn't be giving any more funding to the World Health Organization. Perhaps we should start a new organization. What are your thoughts?
I'll be honest, I don't really have any position on. I mean, that's really for the national leadership to decide on what their position is in terms of the World Health Organization. My view, generally speaking, is that these sorts of international organizations are generally, once they're entrusted with too much power or too much influence, subject to a great deal of corruption. And they prove the point that top-down leadership, in fact, whenever it's so invasive as it has been, and everyone's been looking to just the World Health Organization for guidance, actually doesn't produce better outcomes, it produces worse. Because everyone commits to the same policy at the same time, and if it's a catastrophe, we all wear it equally. And it's the same thing in relation to politicians. I'd say the same. Much like the World Health Organization, Prime Minister, I really don't want to get my health advice from politicians. I'll speak to my doctor, I'll consult my own experts. I do not want to get my health advice from politicians, nor do I want to get health advice from public health bureaucrats who are incentivized to lean one way or the other. I think it's a kind of cognitive dissonance within society that in one breath, an individual will turn around when you ask them, what do you most closely associate with politicians? And they'll say liars. And then the next breath, they're expected to trust that same person with their health. It doesn't make sense. So my view fundamentally is, ultimately, if these people want to restore the public trust, if they want to restore the public confidence, they should start liberalizing their policies, and they should stop cramming information down people's throats that in 3 months ends up being wrong anyway. They don't have the answers and they shouldn't pretend. It's a natural event, it's a natural occurrence of viruses. If someone's responsible for unleashing it, it's one of the worst probably bioweapons in history, I would say, given the fact that it's got such a low mortality rate. But in any case, it's something which society has dealt with. It's something that we will deal with. We do not need politicians invading every aspect of our life. The less they do, the more trust we will have in them.
Well, Mike Pompeo actually reckoned that another virus could come out of that same virology institute in Wuhan. And I believe they're building other ones as well. I'd like to read a comment from Pascal. President of Philippines threatened jail time if citizens refuse vaccine. If that is in fact true, could the same thing happen here?
You're asking me legally? Is it possible?
Legally, theoretically, could that theoretically happen?
Theoretically, I can't think of any reason why it couldn't. Essentially, if it was a state piece of legislation that criminalized you, and there was a federal piece of legislation that said the opposite, and it covered the field, you might be able to get a ruling that the state law was invalid. But if the federal government didn't say anything about it, or the federal government was the one criminalizing you really don't have any rights to rely on in the Commonwealth Constitution. It's why George Mason and people like that in the times of the American foundations were actually arguing at those federal conventions in the 18th century that the Constitution was incomplete and we won't vote for it unless it has a Bill of Rights attached to it. Now, in this country, the idea of a Bill of Rights was never really debated in our federal conventions. We had one small debate on a 14th Amendment clause, but it's always been something missing. And the difficulty we face these days is if you argue about a Bill of Rights, normally it gets expanded to a right to healthcare and a right to, Sundays on Sunday and everything else. And that's another deep problem we have here. But in terms of criminalizing people, I mean, we've already determined that they can criminalize you for what you choose not to put on your body after they've told you to put something on your body. I don't see where the limit would come in if they start telling you what you have to put in your body and you object to that. So, if they created a law criminalizing you or fining you for not getting a vaccine, happy to take the case. But at the end of the day, it's one of those areas which is only possible to be addressed really through systemic reform. If you want to take that out of the picture, you don't elect different politicians, you change the system.
Right. I can tell you it's a question that's on my mind. I work in disability support, so I do in fact wonder if I'm next. Rory, do you have the next one?
I do. I have an audience question here. It says the vaccine rollout has been pretty slow, and I suspect that to improve the numbers, the government will introduce a digital passport to prove that you have been vaccinated so that you can do anything free of restrictions. Is that the best incentive they can come up with? I know other countries around the world have created like a lottery ticket that you get once you've been vaccinated. What are your thoughts on incentivizing people to get it?
I mean, there's a lot of different incentives. I saw in the US, people were getting Krispy Kreme donuts and things like that. I mean, it ranges from the small and, the unusual to just the outright obscene. And, lottery tickets or new cars is on that end of the spectrum. I'm not sure why getting a vaccine is such a heroic act that all of a sudden you should get a new car or something. But, as with these things, it's already a sort of ludicrous concept. So you can take it as far as you want, really. It's only subject to your own imagination. And, if they want to give everyone who gets a vaccine a new car, I mean, we just have to borrow more money ultimately. It's not like anyone cares about debt these days. The reality is vaccine passports were, in the beginning, the general idea was coming from the opposition. The opposition last year was saying, listen, once the vaccine comes, they're going to create a situation where if you don't have it, you'll be a second-class citizen. And if you do have it, you'll show your papers and you'll get certain perks. And now that which was, conspiracy delusion by, most journalists back then is now the accepted path forward by a majority of reputable journalists and things like that in the mainstream media. And then there's politicians talking about it. The Prime Minister is talking about it now. That's not the way forward. The way forward is you treat your Australian citizens as equal as they are. We have an equality in this country of citizenship, or we're supposed to. Vaccine passports fundamentally violates that principle. Now, can he impose that? The question is really one for the High Court. There might be some argument to say that you can't discriminate based on those grounds, but it would have to be another implied limitation, and you'd have to imply it from places which the High Court already is uncomfortable moving into anyway. So is it a good incentive? I don't think so. Is it legal? Potentially. I mean, it's a bit dubious. But as an incentive, I'm sure some people will decide they're not prepared to wait another 3 years to go overseas or to go interstate. They'd prefer to get the vaccine, get the paper, and then once they've got their papers, they can go across borders or whatever. But there's also the issue we face in terms of restrictions. In countries like Israel, where they have had a very large vaccination rate, they are finding that there are still waves of infection occurring, and they're having to reintroduce mask mandates and things like that. So even if people do get vaccinated, there's no guarantee that those passports, or whatever you want to call it, are a ticket to freedom. So you can sort of draw this out as far as you want. You can have a vaccine passport, but then make it conditional every year someone has to go and get a booster shot, because God knows that's the next thing around the corner as well. You're going to need a booster shot every year when you get the vaccine in order to keep it updated, in order to keep it strong. And I don't want to get too much. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but just speaking economically, a pharmaceutical company has a great deal of financial incentive to produce that model, because it means every year governments, guaranteed buyers with no spending limit, will bid for booster shots. So at a certain point, you just have to call the scam for what it is. You have to move forward on that basis. There's too many people with incentives to cause corruption at play here, and they're the ones with positions of high office and power.
Definitely, and I think it's a serious concern there. I've just got a follow up with that. An audience member has said that vaccine passports do exist in a different form. If you were to go to Africa, for example, this person is mentioning that you need a yellow fever card to confirm that you've had different boosters and things like that. So I think it's definitely a very serious concern that could quite happen. What were you going to say, Andrew?
No, I've managed to lose it. I've managed to lose it. My apologies.
No worries. I had another comment from an audience member here. It says, Sir Edmund Barton would be rolling in his grave to see what happened to us as a nation. The founding fathers who worked hard to form us at a federation would be heartbroken. Would you agree?
I would agree. I mean, not just Edmund Barton, because, you know, we had founders like Sir Samuel Griffith and Sir Andrew, oh, I shouldn't say Sir, but Andrew Inglis Clark from Tasmania. We had Alfred Deakin from Victoria. We had people like that who worked very hard to determine the specific boundaries of government in this country, who worked very hard in order to federate the country in such a manner as to make it consistent not only with its Westminster traditions, but also to make it consistent with federal ideas that we have introduced from the United States into our system. And our constitution is structured very much like the United States. There was very rigorous debates. There was very rigorous legal discussions. There was very robust sort of public debates as well. I mean, the Australian people voted on this thing, and fundamentally over the last 100 years, it's been progressively in decline to such a point now where the federal government has certain powers which are extraordinarily wide, and the state governments have absolutely no limit simultaneously on what they have left. So, if you were to put it to a framer back in the 1890s, that after all of these conventions, there would still be the possibility that hard borders would go up and you wouldn't be able to cross from one state to the other. They would have just looked at you and said, well, what's the purpose? The whole purpose was so that we federate one country, multiple jurisdictions, we can move around freely, we can trade, we can go to each other's states and we won't be discriminated against. You know, go section 117 if you want to look at some of the ideas on that. And at the end of the day, you end up back where you started, which is essentially you end up with 6 penal colonies where people aren't allowed to move around, not even from city to city. So it's a regression in many ways, constitutional.
I know we're almost out of time. If I can quickly ask a question, you mentioned federalizing health. Can you explain more about that, and how could that come about?
Sure. Well, essentially, the Commonwealth government does have the ability to step in on this. There isn't any real limit as to intergovernmental sort of limits. The federal government has annexed areas of state government authority in the past. The way that they can do that is by making laws in relation to health based on international instruments or conventions. Under Section 51 of the Constitution, they can create laws on the external affairs power, which have a domestic effect, but they're based on obviously international conventions, based on World Health Organization, recommendations or conventions or treaties or whatever you want to call it. They implement a regime of basically control over hospitals or health or whatever, however broadly they want. That would then cover the field effectively in a legal sense. They can even manufacture inconsistency by saying specifically in the law that this is to be read inconsistently with any respective state legislation. And by doing that, there would obviously be legal challenges, but essentially what that would do is that would grab power from the state governments and take it to the federal level. And that's been a concern of constitutional lawyers for some time, because in a country where state government powers traditionally have been in decline and the federal government's been grabbing more and more, there was always a great fear that the federal government were going to grab education or health next, because those are very big fields for the state government. They're really a couple of the only fields really substantially left. That they would implement some sort of international treaty and they would grab those things. Now, thankfully, the federal government hasn't done that, okay? But it's certainly something which Scott Morrison could do if he wanted to. And I'm sure that there's enough constitutional reasoning behind it to justify it in the High Court. You'd have a 109 case and it'd be inconsistent with state legislation, and all the state legislation essentially would be tossed.
But if I can throw a quick counterpoint, what happens if someone like Daniel Andrews then federalizes health?
Well, someone, you're saying if he was the Prime Minister, let's say.
If he were the Prime Minister.
I don't want him to federalize health. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying legally he could. That's all I'm saying. Legally he could. I don't want the federal government grabbing any more powers than they should. To sort of poorly quote Chief Justice Gibbs, I wouldn't want the federal government doing anything that the state governments can do just as well. And that's not even a very high standard. I think that the state governments can fail just as well as the federal government can in doing things. And they should be able to do that. So I'm not in favor of the federal government grabbing health. I'm in favor of limiting the state government's power in relation to these things. But just because that's my opinion and that's my preference, it doesn't change the fact federally they do have arguments they can make to grab health theoretically.
So the very last question I had here is for people who were concerned about the way our country is being governed, for people who were concerned about emergency powers, maybe becoming permanent powers, what would your advice be to people who were concerned? What can they do to further their country the way they want?
I'd say, and I'm going to go out on a limb here. I don't want to be, in any way insulting my host, but I'd say don't vote for any of the major parties at this point in time. And that's with all respect to you guys and with all respect to the Liberals that are against lockdowns, my view is that the factions in these parties needs to be, in order to gain people's trust, Liberals against lockdowns, Labor against lockdowns, Liberals for lockdowns, and Labor against lockdowns. For lockdowns. In my view, unless these lines are drawn in the sand as to coercive laws, people should be voting for their alternatives. If the major parties are going to give us despotism as our only option, then they shouldn't be voted for. The other thing that people can do is they can lobby their local member of parliament, and they can raise on social media, and they can raise to their neighbours, this country has systemic issues that need to be addressed. I'm not talking about a voice to parliament. I'm talking about genuinely limiting power. That's an issue which needs to be discussed systemically. People should educate themselves on our constitutional system of government, and they should have a chat with their neighbours and chat with their family that some sort of amendment needs to be raised after this to make sure that this does not happen again.
Perfect. All right. That's all we have time for this evening. So thanks so much, Cameron. Much appreciated for coming on board. I'd also like to thank our co-host, Andrew. And I'd also like a shout out to our producers, Sam and Daniel. Thanks so much for being able to create this episode today. It's been fantastic. We'll catch you all at the next one on Sunday Sessions. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.